Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the ADBI annual conference. We will now continue with the seventh presentation. I will introduce the chair for this session, and she will then lead us through the next 75 minutes. So the chair for this session is Dr. Rachita Gulati, who is a research fellow at the ADBI, and her research work focuses on banking and financial institutions, financial stability, climate change for banks, corporate governance, inclusive banking, and efficiency and productivity analysis. So Rachita also had an experience working at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and also the Indian Institute of Technology at Roorkee. So without further ado, I would like to ask Rachita to start sharing the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for a nice introduction. So I welcome you all and the speaker and the discussant for this session. And we are now approaching close to the end of the annual conference of ADBI, and we are at the paper session 7. I hope all the participants had a wonderful time in advancing their knowledge on such a timely and important subject. For this session, we have with us Professor Mathias from the University of Lausanne. Professor Mathias has many accolades in his profile, but to mention a few, I would like to say that Professor Mathias is a professor of economics at the School of Business and Economics at University of Lausanne. He is also a CEPR fellow in international trade, political economy, and macro programs. He has held many positions as a visiting and the statutory appointments at International Monetary Fund, MIT, Queen's Mary University of London. And his research interests includes the development, international trade, and the political economy of conflicts and migration. He has published in major international publications, international journals, including American Economic Review and Econometrica, to name a few. So Professor Mathias will be presenting on a very interesting topic on charting prosperity, geopolitics, and Asia's economic future. So paper seems very interesting to me and highlights the importance of geoeconomics in attaining high income status for Asian middle income countries, with a special focus on China, India, Indonesia, and Philippines. It would be exciting for all of us to hear his views. And with the speaker, we have two discussants for this session, Dr. Ajay Shah and the Professor Shandre from Sunway University. So with this, without wasting much time, I would like to hand over to Professor Mathias for listening to his views on this very interesting topic.
Thank you, Rachita, for the great introduction. Very kind. I'm delighted to present this paper among in front of an audience of experts on the topic. So I'm expert on the Asia. So I'm going to talk about geopolitics and trade, and more precisely, the question I want to tackle today is how geopolitics, affect the prospect of attaining high income status for Asian countries that are currently middle income countries. And even more specifically, I want to talk about how to manage economic interdependence in a context of rising geopolitical tensions, that potentially pose a challenge to future economic prosperity in the region. And so the trade-offs are quite clear here. On the one hand, maybe Asian countries should engage in trade relations, even with potential geopolitical rivals, with the aim, of maximizing peacetime profits. But of course, if you engage with rivals, you are at risk of experiencing some disruption in your trade in case of rising tensions. On the other hand, Asian countries could look at de-risking their global value chains by diversifying their import sources, away from rivals, to do more friendshoring. There is an obvious cost to that because by friendshoring, you don't necessarily minimize your cost and maximize your profits. And lastly, last element that matters a lot also in this, when it turns to managing economic interdependence, is the fact that, the way you couple or decouple your economies from the one of your neighbors may feedback on the geopolitical risk itself. Okay, so that this last channel has been vastly overlooked in the literature and by policymakers. Okay, so to be clear, I want to put some number here. So to use a quantitative analysis, to put numbers on what are the geo-economic trade-off, what are the geo-economic cost and benefits. And so for this purpose, I will use some quantitative models that I will explain to you in a few minutes. So as was mentioned by Rachita before, I was mostly focused on China, India, Indonesia, and Philippines. That was what ADB asked me to do. But of course, the analysis I'm going to present today could be extended to more countries. So I will first present the quantitative framework and then look at the historical evolution in the past 3 decades of trade dependencies within the region and analyze how this historical evolution changed the geopolitical balance of power between the main actors in this region. And then last part of my talk will be about simulating prospective trade policies and to see how these future policies may affect both economic prosperity and peace in the region. So let me jump into the quantitative model. But before that, I want to tell you the logic, the spirit of the overall approach. What I'm going to do is originate from the theory of doux commerce, sweet commerce in English, which is a theory that was first articulated by a French philosopher, Montesquieu, in the 18th century, which basically states that trade dependence raises the opportunity cost of war. And by doing that, it should discipline leaders and countries and force them to de-escalate tensions. So a key element underlying the reason why trade dependence may contribute to raising the opportunity cost of war, the OCW, is the fact that conflicts disrupt trade. It's to a large extent quite obvious, but it's empirically well-grounded. So as an illustration, I have reported here the evolution of trade between India and Pakistan in the past 70 years, where I compare the observed in green here trade between the two countries with respect to one which is what they should trade according to a gravity prediction of trade. And so what you see, and each circle here represents a major conflict or violent event between the two, interstate dispute between the two countries. And what you see is that in the 50s, the two countries were over-trading with respect to what gravity would predict, quite massively. It's a log scale here. And as conflicts accumulated across the 50s and 60s, you see a sharp decline in their level of trade. Such as in the early 2000s, the level of trade between those two giants, those two big neighbors, populated countries, the trade you observe in the data represent less than 1% of what they should trade according to the gravity prediction. Okay, so it's correlational evidence, but it really indicates, that the history of violence between those two countries participated to deplete their trade. Good. On the right here, you have a more quantitative estimates by Glick and Taylor in 2010 on the effect of interstate conflict on trade. What you observe is that during war, trade on average is reduced by 85% between the two belligerents and revert to the pre-war level after 1 decade. Not only that, but you also observe that trade between each belligerent and the rest of the world, what I'm going to call multilateral trade in the rest of my presentation, multilateral trade is depleted by 12% between each belligerent and the rest of the world, and also revert after 7-8 years. Okay, so this is the spirit. That's this sweet commerce view. Okay. So now the quantitative framework I'm going to use here today is, has been developed across the past 10-15 years by my co-authors and myself, in a series of papers. And I'm going to summarize quickly, briefly. Okay, so the framework models the two-way causation between trade policy and peace diplomacy. Okay, so trade dependencies affect bargaining power in negotiations. Bargaining power in negotiations affect the risk of conflict, which feed back on trade. So we combine a diplomatic game with a standard structural gravity model of trade. The purpose of the diplomatic game is, to show why rational leaders, despite the very large cost of war, may fail at diffusion tensions, such as in some state of the world, you observe an escalation of disputes to a full war. Okay, so this is called the paradox of war, this thing. The purpose of the trade model is really to quantify the effects. And today I'm going to consider a very simple trade model. It has only final goods. There is no intermediate goods, so no input-output linkages, no physical capital. So it's a framework I've developed I use in a paper I released last year. But of course, the trade model could be refined and made more. Could be refined should you have some interest in some aspects. And the trade data I'm going to use are from Head and Mayer, 2021. And so I observe countries, trade between Asian countries until 2017. You will see that the analysis reveals that diplomatic and trade margins can be connected in a very transparent way. The key connector here being the concept of opportunity cost of war. And so this opportunity cost of war, you have to think of it as foregone real consumption when war erupts. And I use the structural gravity model, the trade model, to quantify this opportunity cost of war. So very quickly, the setup is made of is a multi-country world. Both trade and war are endogenous. And so I consider that, for a completely exogenous reason, a reason that can be economic in nature, that can be related to internal politics, that can be related to cultural struggle, that can be related to, ego rants and hubris of some leaders. But for those exogenous reasons, a geopolitical dispute arises between two countries, I and J. And they must do something to stop the escalation, because if nothing is done, this dispute will escalate into a war between I and J. Okay, I will explain you in one slide what is a war here. take it as given for the moment. Okay, so first, I and J have to agree on a diplomatic protocol, under which they will negotiate. And under this protocol, they need to reach an agreement on a transfer from I to J. So this transfer can be positive if I is giving something to J, but is a negative transfer if I receive something from J. So it's an algebraic object. And this transfer is a transfer of an external good. That can be a resource, right? You can agree to transfer part of a territory, to give access to a territory. It could be some rents associated with an oil field, with a natural resources that you agree to share with the other country. It can be an access to water body. It can be a territorial revendication, on some islands somewhere. Okay, but this transfer can be also something on diplomatic concessions that are relevant for the payoff of each country, right? But just concessions, about admitting some responsibility in a past war, something like that. Anyway, they have to negotiate on this transfer. If they fail to reach an agreement, then diplomacy fails and war occurs. Okay? And then, conditional on the state of the world, war or peace, a country gets its real consumption plus the transfer, if it's peace, and under war gets its consumption minus the cost of war. And this cost is a random shock. And with some informational asymmetry. Okay, so country I has better information on its own shock than the other country has. Okay, so that's informational asymmetry, and that will explain you why negotiation may fail. Okay, so how do we parameterize war in this context? So there are several ways of doing it. So I use a calibration from my last year paper. I assume that war leads to some human losses with a 8% decrease in population, to economic damages with 8% decrease in productivity, and with a disruption of trade. Okay, so such as in order to calibrate, when I use the click and tailor results I showed you a few slides ago as empirical targets. Okay, so meaning that on average, trade between belligerents declines by 85%, and trade between each belligerent as well, rest of the world declined by 12%. Okay, so I will not spend too much time on the trade model because it's very standard. I want to explain you more the details of the diplomatic game, which is, I think the most less known part. Okay, so diplomacy here is a bargaining under asymmetric information, and I rely on mechanism design here to have some maximal generality in the results. Okay, so the leaders are free to choose in a very large class of diplomatic protocols. They can go for one-shot peace conference. They can go for a multi-repeated sequence of negotiations. Those negotiations can be public or secret. They can be mediated by other, governmental or non-governmental bodies, etc., etc. And at each moment in the negotiation, because it's peace diplomacy, those countries there is no superpower forcing them to stay on the negotiation table. So such as each leader can leave the negotiation table at any moment. It's a non-binding protocol. And so we solve this type of diplomatic games, using mechanism design toolkit. And we can show that a critical factor influencing the decision of belligerents to resolve disputes peacefully is this opportunity cost of war, which is a differential of real consumption, so it's payoff relevant, differential of real consumption between peace and war. And intuitively, and I think it's very important you get this intuition right, to settle dispute, the country with the largest opportunity cost of war should, transfer something to the country with the lowest opportunity cost of war. Okay, so having a high opportunity cost of war erodes your negotiation power, and so you have to transfer something to the other country. But of course, because of informational asymmetry, leaders will strategically misreport their opportunity cost of war. They will pretend during negotiations that the opportunity cost of war is actually lower than what is their actual opportunity cost of war, in order to extract more concession from the other country. Okay. By doing that, they take the risk of negotiation failure, because if the two leaders misreport too much, then negotiation fails. Okay, so the main outcome of this diplomatic game is a welfare formula in the shadow of war. You can show that welfare is given by the real consumption, so the standard peacetime welfare, net of geo-economic losses. And so these geo-economic losses are equal to the probability of war, 1 minus S, times the true cost of war when war erupts, plus probability of peace times the concessions on average that you have to make in order to maintain peace. So what you see, this formula makes clear that the welfare impact of conflict is not only happening when war occurs. There is a shadow cost of conflict, which is, in order to prevent conflict, you need to make concessions. That's quite natural, but this framework allows you to put numbers using data on those concessions you have to make to maintain peace. Those three components of the geo-economic loss all depend on the opportunity cost of war. Okay, so the probability of peace, what I call the probability of de-escalating tensions, increase with the opportunity cost of war. So that's the original Montesquieu sweet commerce view. The true cost of war is increasing with the opportunity cost of war. That's almost a tautology. But you have to keep in mind that in the current world context, many countries, many policymakers actually have this objective in mind. They want to decouple their economy from their rivals in order to reduce what would be the cost of war in case of war. But the last element are those diplomatic concessions, PKC, that you have to make in order to maintain peace. I call them peacekeeping costs, and you can show that the peacekeeping costs for country I are increasing in the differential between the opportunity cost of war for I and the opportunity cost of war for J. So the more asymmetrical is this differential of opportunity cost of war, the more country I has to make concessions to J to maintain peace. Okay, so those are, and this, in my view, this element of diplomatic concessions, that has been overlooked in the policy debate. Okay, anyway, what you can show is that all those elements, those components of the geo-economic loss depend on the opportunity cost of war, and this opportunity cost of war, you can quantify it with the trade model. So when you do that, you solve the trade model, you simulate it, you can show that the opportunity cost of war, which is the differential consumption between peace and war, depends positively on bilateral imports between the two belligerents. The reason being that if you trade more, if you are more dependent on the trade with your rival, then if war erupts, you lose more. Okay, that's the Montesquieu's view. But what you can show is that this opportunity cost of war decreases with your multilateral trade, with the very fact that you trade more with the rest of the world. Indeed, if a war erupts between the two belligerents, the very fact of trading with the rest of the world gives me some consumption insurance. That reduces my opportunity cost of war because I can trade, I can rely on my imports and exports with the rest of the world in case of war with J. Okay. So this is the main prediction of the model, right? So the bilateral trade dependence, understood as the ratio of bilateral imports over multilateral imports, bilateral trade dependence tends to increase the opportunity cost of war. And this has been confirmed in many empirical studies in the past 15 years. Okay, so I use this model to look first at the historical evolution of trade dependence and geoeconomics in Asia. So I skip this graph. This graph is really a macro view. Still, so that's the evolution of, in the data, of trade openness between those Asian countries. In the past 60 years, it has increased, trade openness, and the evolution of military expenditure, okay, so that have decreased over time. This is macro evidence, it's correlational evidence, it goes in the direction of the liberal view. Still, the question I want to ask is, what are the shadow costs? What has been the cost for some of those countries to maintain peace within the region? So I first look at the geoeconomics of China and India. Here you have the evolution of bilateral trade between India and China. So what you see is that in the past, from 1990 to 2017, bilateral imports, Indian bilateral imports from China has increased massively. Was not the case for Chinese imports from India. Multilateral trade of India has also increased quite a lot. Multilateral openness of China has in fact decreased, such as if you consider the ratio of the two, bilateral over multilateral, which is what I call bilateral trade dependence, you see that bilateral trade dependence of India has massively increased. In 2017, 1/4 of all Indian imports were made of Chinese imports. Were made of imports from China. Okay, so you see there has been an increasing coupling of the two economies, but in a very asymmetrical way. Then you can use your quantitative model to translate this evolution of trade into evolution of geoeconomic factors. And as a result of this asymmetrical coupling of the two economies, what you see in blue is that the opportunity cost of war for India has increased way more than the opportunity cost of war for China. Because those two opportunity costs of war increased, actually the probability of de-escalation, so the probability of peace has increased. That's the black curve, and it goes to 1. So in the past, in 2017, the model tells you that the probability of a conflict, of a dispute escalating into a full conflict between India and China was almost 0 or 0. That's good news. It led to pacification. But at a cost for India, because of this asymmetrical coupling of the two economies, what you can show is in orange is that the concessions that have to be made by India in case of a crisis with China, those concessions on average have increased. That's the orange curve. Such as in 2017, India would have been ready to transfer up to 0.6% of its GDP just to maintain peace with China. Okay, that's a reverse evolution for China. You also observe that the true cost of war, if a war erupts between China and India, the true cost of war for India would be great, would be very, very large, and it has increased a lot, right? That's this red curve. So that could be a concern for policymakers. But actually, the probability of this event to take place is 0. Okay, so you see, war is because of the coupling of the two economies, war has become a very, very expensive thing, but with a probability that goes to 0. So it's not policy relevant. Okay, so the takeaway is that, as you know, relations between India and China, are quite tense since the 2020 border clash in the Galwan Valley. This rise of the geopolitical tensions could be a challenge for India due to its increasing dependence on Chinese imports. So that could be a supportive argument for a partial decoupling between the Indian and Chinese economies. But actually, the simulation results show you that the risk of escalation to a food war is very low, that the decreasing risk of conflict has been offset by the increase in Indian concessions, such as in net, and that's the main takeaway from this simulation, the geoeconomic balance of power between India and China has not shifted significantly in the past 30 years. Okay, so decoupling does not appear as a primary policy objective from a geoeconomic perspective. A more pressing issue is a sharp historical decoupling between India and Pakistan. So in appendix here, if you want to, in the Q&A session, if you want to discuss more this thing, I'm happy to do it. We can do the same now for the China-Indonesia pair of countries. This is the evolution of trade dependencies between Indonesia in blue and China in red. And you get the same picture, but all the effects are more pronounced. The same picture than with China and India. Bilateral dependence of Indonesia vis-à-vis China has massively increased, such as in 2017, more than 1/3 of all imports, Indonesian imports, came from China. As a result of this sharp asymmetrical bilateral dependence, in blue, you see that the opportunity cost of war for Indonesia with a war with China has massively increased. Okay. Such as the concessions in orange that Indonesia has now to make to China to maintain peace represent up to 1% of its GDP. Okay. Reversely, China geopolitical power rose with China receiving transfers from Indonesia on average. Okay, so historically, bilateral trade dependence between China and Indonesia massively increased. That facilitated peace diplomacy. Okay, actually, you can show that the probability of conflict between the two is zero. But that was in a very asymmetrical way. Okay, so that's a large, which led to a large increase in diplomatic concessions to be made by Indonesia to China. So this led to a gradual and substantial shift of geopolitical balance of power in favor of China. And those are arguments for a partial decoupling of the two economies, in order to restore geoeconomic power. But of course, if Indonesia starts to decouple from China, this has a cost in terms of real consumption. Okay, so there is a trade-off for Indonesia between restoring geoeconomic power and reducing real consumption. So there is a need for a quantitative assessment. It's a policy-relevant question. As you know, in the past months, there has been Indonesia has imposed import duties on Chinese goods. So this is the last part, and I go in 1 minute on that. What I do in the paper is that I simulate the geoeconomic consequences of the ongoing negotiation on ACFTA 3.0. And I focus on the Chinese-Indonesia pair. And I consider two polar scenarios, a trade facilitating scenario where I decrease trade barriers between China and all the ASEAN country members up to 20%, and a full decoupling where, not a full decoupling, a decoupling where I increase trade barriers between China and Asia. Okay.
Hi, Mathias.
I just finished, Rachita. I just tell you the main takeaway and I stop here.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So I don't show you the simulation results. That's basically the same. I use a trade model to simulate those changes in trade cost. And the main takeaway is the following. Deepening AFTA is quite neutral for Indonesia, future economic prosperity. Facilitating trade with China would lead to an increase in real consumption of Indonesia, but even further reduction of its geoeconomic bargaining power. And so the increase in real consumption would be completely offset by the decrease in geoeconomic bargaining power. If anything, the simulation shows that in terms of welfare, there is an optimal level of decoupling for Indonesia. For China, deepening NAFTA is welfare enhancing, because deepening NAFTA for China means an increase in real consumption and a further increase in its geo-economic bargaining power. Okay, I'm done. Basically, what you see is that I'm embedding diplomacy and conflict risk in the toolkit of trade policy evaluation, such as I quantify security dilemmas that are affecting development trajectories of Asian middle-income countries. This framework can be adjusted to more countries, to other policies, and to a more complex trade model with input-output linkages and non-tradable sectors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mathias. So with this, I hope all the audience have enjoyed your quantitative approach to looking at the trade dependencies and how it impacts the geo-economic balance. So now I would like to invite Dr. Ajay Shah, the first discussant for the paper. So Dr. Ajay Shah is the fellow from the USC Los Angeles. He held several positions at the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, IGIDR, Mumbai, the Department of Economic Affairs at the Ministry of Finance and the National Institute for the Public Finance and the Policy. He is now the co-founder of XKDR Forum. So I hand over to you. So I request you to please keep the comments in the 12 to 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to ADB Institute for bringing me into this important paper. And I have some thoughts and comments on the importance of this work, on some thoughts and concerns on how we could potentially analyze the place of this kind of work in the real world. Okay, so all of us have watched the end of an era where we thought that globalization was working out well, and we are back to the unpleasant world of political and military risk interwoven on top of our ways of globalization. So now we have to think deeply about the ways in which trade and FDI will operate in this difficult world that we see around us. And so I want to fully endorse the paper and the research strategy, and this work is incredibly important. I felt that one of the basic insights of the paper is sound, that there are some trade-offs where geo-economic considerations justify sacrificing some of the gains from trade, as we would have seen in a static trade theory model. Now, all over the world, the practitioners of economic statecraft and international relations and military affairs are grappling with these questions and searching for the practical solutions. So I would be very excited about the extent to which economic research can help practitioners navigate these questions better. So I want to remind everybody in this room that all war takes place because of a failure of negotiations, and ex post, one of the two people who went to war was always wrong. Okay, so I feel all of us know for sure that it was a mistake for Putin to have invaded Ukraine. Ex post, we know that, but ex ante, he did not know that. So to the extent that all of us are able to develop a shared paradigm and a philosophy and quantitative estimates that will help us analyze these problems, I think that it can help give us a world with less war, which could be pretty cool. So I feel this kind of work is very important, and more power to the author and to the others who are building this literature. And for me personally, living in India, the paper was rich with interest because I start asking myself, how do these results on China and India illuminate the Indian policy planning? As an aside, I just want to say that precisely by 2017, where in the reasoning of the model, the probability of war should be going to near zero levels. It also became the case that there was a certain amount of complexity on the border. In 2017, there was a conflict on the China-Bhutan border where I think the Chinese government was making a point that Indian security guarantees for Bhutan do not mean that much. So I think that there was an attempt at making a point that, look, we're so powerful that your concepts of a diplomatic arrangement are no longer correct. This is what they were saying to Bhutan. And of course, it involves India because traditionally India has been the guarantor of security for Bhutan. And then in 2020, we got violence at the border at Ladakh and the forcible change of territory. So it is very troubling to think about these things. And as a non-specialist in this literature, I want to curiously ask the question that how does the bargaining game come to an end? Why does it not become that the stronger country will keep on extracting one concession after another? What is the equilibrium where it stops? This is something I have not yet been able to understand, and it would be lovely to understand this more. Okay. Now I start at some small questions. I looked at the results for the China-India pair. It appears inexorable that for India, the bilateral trade share is much higher. And for India, the geo-economic loss is much higher. And similar results also apply with the India-Pakistan pair, which is shown on page 23. So just recklessly generalizing. Is this a rough characterization of any large country, small country relationship? Would this be the rough flavor of the results for Russia, Ukraine? Would this be the rough flavor of the results for China, Taiwan? Would this be the rough flavor of the results for China, Vietnam? Okay, so does this kind of bilateral trade-based reasoning inexorably lead to the outcome that Indonesia has to put up as much as 1% of GDP as a payment to China for China to promise to not undertake military action? If so, it is actually a gloomy world and it underlines the importance of not standing alone in a bilateral game, which brings me to the next set of points. Once again, I don't wish to disrespect the work. I am an economist and I understand the importance of building simple models and making progress. But at the same time, I want to say that the model has limitations. So as an example, consider India-Pakistan. India-Pakistan is a completely flourishing trade that is conducted through Dubai. So both countries have restrictions against direct bilateral trade. And what it boils down to is an additional cost of shipping. So goods go from Bombay to Dubai and get reshipped from Dubai to Pakistan. And so effectively, de facto, India and Pakistan remains a flourishing trade relationship today. It is just that the direct transportation over the land border has broken down. So you could think of it as a non-trade barrier that has been erected. And as long as you will fly through Dubai or you will take a container ship through Dubai, you've got a very open trade relationship. So the adverse impact is not as bad as would meet the eye, because actually there is just a certain amount of trade diversion going on. Next, I want to think about substitutability. When the military problems intruded on the China-India trade, first in 2017 on the Bhutan border, and then in 2020 on the India border, the Indian government threw up all kinds of restrictions against Chinese imports. And this would be something that flows from the logic of the paper that you should reduce your dependence because the bargaining can go very unpleasant. But I would argue that the welfare impact in India was relatively modest. In the limit, imagine that you think of a globally tradable widget where goods arbitrage more or less equalizes the global price of the widget. So when you do not source that widget from China, you're sourcing a similar widget from Japan or Indonesia or South Korea, and the cost of transportation is similar. So my opinion is that I have watched the Indian journey from 2017 onwards. One after another, trade restrictions have come in. As an example, Huawei has been fully thrown out of all communication equipment purchases in India after 2017. But the switches sold by Ericsson in India are pretty good and they are at a comparable price. So I would wonder how this would play out in the lens of the trade theoretical model. Once again, I recognize this is a bilateral trade-based paper, but I'm just hungry for more, and I would request the author to envision how we could go further in this line of reasoning. So as an example, I think the really important question is how difficult is it to change sourcing? If ASML makes machines in Netherlands, which are really unique, they are the world's best machines that make integrated circuits, and there is no real substitute. They're the only game in town for those high-end machines. Then the loss of the Chinese ability to purchase those machines is material. For everything else, the impacts are relatively modest, is how I understand it. So as an example, for India, there is a very big generic drug industry, which includes exporting generic drugs on a large scale, which begins by purchasing APIs from Chinese companies. And China is a dominant player in the global API business. So substitutability would be more difficult. Okay, and as an aside, I am co-author of an article on an Indian industrial policy strategy or how to address this problem. I see the problem there. I think that problem is more genuine. But when it comes to Chinese machine tools, I think that they're very substitutable. You could buy machine tools from South Korea, you could buy machine tools in Japan, you could buy machine tools from Taiwan, and you would pretty much have the same product. So I think it's of essence to think of the extent of substitutability. And then that takes us to the next story that, okay, would we think in a purely bilateral model, or would we think in a more complex multilateral world? I suspect that if the methods of this paper had been applied to Russia-Ukraine, then any bilateral analysis would have shown that Ukraine was in a very weak position. In fact, Ukraine was in a very strong position because Joe Biden and NATO were able to assemble a global coalition that supported Ukraine, and the ex-post cost of war was frightfully high for Russia. And so the real world outcome was very different from what a bilateral model would have suggested. And as an example, the cost of war that has been experienced by Russia is a vivid example for China to consider when they might choose to take on Taiwan. So I think that multilateral reasoning is central for some countries, countries that are well integrated into the world of alliances. But it is interesting that some countries are pretty isolated. Some countries practice a concept of strategic autonomy. Under conditions of strategic autonomy, simple bilateral analysis can be more useful because most small countries understand how they could get picked off in a bilateral conflict and they would like to find allies. But some small countries do behave with strategic autonomy. So maybe that is a way to think about it, that some countries have more alliances and then the bilateral model is less useful. Some countries are engaging in strategic autonomy and then they are more vulnerable against a neighbor with a much larger GDP. And this also should help us think about the future, that perhaps United States might become more isolationist in the years to come. And then either I am a country and I think that I am alone. So either Ukraine may think that I am alone, or Taiwan may think that I am alone, or Ukraine or Taiwan or any other country at the receiving end of a large neighbor needs a new wave of alliances that are able to create conditions that diverge from the simple bilateral reasoning, even without the United States, or even with a more malfunctioning NATO. So post-Trump, perhaps we will see these two things happening. That on one hand, some countries are more alone, and then you get the logic of the bilateral model that maybe Indonesia should just fork up 1% of GDP and buy peace with China, or Indonesia needs a new wave of alliances. Maybe there is a new Asian NATO that should be constructed centering on Japan, which can better solve the crisis of the bilateral model. So once again, I'm not dissing the paper. I think the paper is important. It makes us think about the consequences of a bilateral model. So finally, I would suggest to the author that it's worth locating the paper inside the larger reasoning around the evolution of globalization. I think we went through a first globalization, 1870 to 1913. We went through a second globalization, 1982 to 2017. We're now in the third globalization, and we should all be analyzing the world of that third globalization. And in that, we should go away from the static trade model to a more dynamic view. For example, a dynamic view of innovation and competition shows us how the USSR and the communist bloc was unable to deal with the trade isolation that came after 1945. They were just not able to innovate and compete with the West. And that is how the whole thing changed completely against the communist bloc. So I'm at the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. So I will come back to Mathias to respond. So let us first invite Professor Shandre for his comments.
Thank you, Rachita. Excellent comment, Dr. Shah. I don't think so I can add much to what you said, but let me try to make some comments and see whether I can help a little bit on the discussions. Okay. The key part of the paper is trying to explain the relationship between geoeconomics and the trade dependency in East Asia. And as Professor Mathias explained, he gave more detail in his presentation than in the paper, because I was looking for more details of his model, the parameters he used for simulation, and the kind of data that he used. Apparently, it's not in the paper. So my comments will very more qualitative in nature. And hopefully I can see more of this quantitative data and the simulation data maybe in other papers. So fairly, it examines the impact of trade intensity and dependency. It's not dependency, but also the trade intensity in managing geopolitics in East Asia. From what I understand, East Asia also include India, China, and India, Pakistan itself. Fairly focused more on China, India, Indonesia, and there's also some discussion on Philippines, I believe. Undertake quantitative analysis. Fairly, the model is still not very clear to me, but fairly I can see how the gravity model has been done. But again, the gravity models are done at a very disaggregated level, at a product level. But here, I believe from the presentation, there's no intermediate goods, so there's no GVC impact. There's no real trade dependency driven by GVC in East Asia. That's what driving now the growth. So fairly, the results are straightforward. Trade policy to reduce economic costs in the event of conflict is low, and sometimes it's misleading, as stated in the paper. Honestly, it's a very good paper. I enjoy reading it. The analytics are very interesting, and the way the paper well written and presented was very interesting. Okay, so let me start my comment. Some key comments. So fairly, one of the things I was trying to figure out was this is a very political economy, game theory kind of work, but not completely a game theory, because you still need to look for an equilibrium to solve many of these issues that we are looking for. So fairly, I was looking for what are the channels or transmission mechanism of geoeconomics. Fairly, it have to be driven by private sector to geopolitics that is driven by the government. So fairly, that is what this paper is trying to address. How the geoeconomics trade dependency will affect the geopolitical outcomes. But there's also another aspect to this. How does geopolitics itself, the reverse causation to geoeconomics itself? That itself is another evolving literature I will discuss in my next slide. So fairly, geoeconomics or geopolitics, I can tell you how ASEAN was formed. ASEAN was formed in 1967 after the invasion of Indonesia on Singapore, right after it got its independence in 1965. So the ASEAN was formed because to avoid this kind of one-day war confrontation, and they call that ASEAN confrontacy. And to avoid it, we formed the ASEAN with the ASEAN 5. That includes Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, Indonesia, and Brunei. So that is the initial 5 that was born. And then now we evolved for 10. That includes the other ASEAN LDCs, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and now East Timor is going to join us. So it's a long enduring trading bloc in the world now. And fairly, we have economic cooperation. And so far, you have not seen any war. And then I don't think so we're going to see any war in this region itself. So one important channel that this ASEAN coalition drives is the reinforcement of the market, the rule-based trading framework. And the rule-based trading framework actually established many dimensions for ASEAN itself. One is clear dispute settlements and even dispute settlements between government themselves, because rule-based, market-based, and that allows global international institutions to set up the framework for any dispute resolution or political conflicts like the South China Sea issues itself. So fairly, it allows us to manage the geopolitics in an integrated way. One is reduce risk. So fairly, Mathias' paper, there's some discussion about risk, fairly whether it's institutional risk, political risk. Risks are very forward-looking. Would like to see some of that. Improves and provide a framework for dispute settlement and reinforce intellectual property right, and of course, emphasize trade and investment. 2 issues that are clearly missing in the trade dependency thing is not just trade, it's also movement of capital, like exactly what Professor Shah was talking about, increasing the role of and the leverage of multinationals into geopolitics because of the GVC. GVCs are driven by multinationals. Government don't drive any GVC itself. So technology and the fragmentation, agglomeration driven by GVC is completely left out in the paper itself, which is very fundamental when we talk about whether GVC disruption or GVC resilience and the transmission mechanism of shocks. Fairly, those things are becoming very critical for us. The last one is movement of people. So integration is not trade dependency, it's not just trade, it's also movement of people, skilled and unskilled workers. Large number of Indian workers are in Singapore, and a large number of Bangladeshi and Pakistani and Myanmar workers are in Singapore. How would you account for that in terms of war, in terms of trade conflicts, in terms of even geopolitics itself? So fairly, I think the interdependency or trade dependency, you underestimate the interdependency that the region itself drives. So, and looking at the presentation itself and then trying to look at 2 countries, one with India and China, the other one is India and Pakistan. It seems like countries that do more trade have to provide more concession than a country that does less trade. But if you include the movement of people, Chinese investment around, BRI, and so on and so forth, I think the interdependency might change quite a bit. So my question to Professor Mathias is, what is the equilibrium you're looking for? Exactly what Mr. Shah is looking for. What is the sub-game equilibrium when in this kind of game that you want to play? Where is the sub-game equilibrium? I believe it might be a corner solution where China will extract all the surpluses from us and will push for a confrontation rather than a zero war, because he knows that the smaller countries have to give a lot of concession, which will bring us to a corner solution. So I do not know what equilibrium you're going to get in your model itself. So fairly, that articulation will be important, I think. And then let me, the next comment is the reverse causality. I think reverse causality is becoming very important for us. That is geopolitics, geoeconomics itself. And papers are already coming out in this called Economic Policy Uncertainty, called EPU. And the transmission mechanism of political shocks in an integrated global environment are becoming very important. For example, the shock of Ukraine-Russia war is not regional, but also global. GVC disruption, supply-induced inflation, increased geopolitical risk at both global and regional level. Even in Asia, we can feel the political risk through the transmission through the financial markets. So there are great diversion and great creation effects, decoupling effects occurring, and more is coming towards East Asia. So fairly, there are already studies are looking at the reverse causation because Mathias' paper is from geoeconomics and politics, but there are a lot of papers that trying to look at geopolitics to geoeconomics itself. I have contributed some paper in this on the Indian economy itself. And quickly, this is the last two slides for me. There's some look into Asia and ASEAN, and then fairly after that ASEAN-China, not after ASEAN-China FTA was discussed with the new framework of ASEAN-China FTA 3.0. The real politics is this. The real politics is ASEAN was asking for more integration with China, and China was refusing to actually go for their 3. We were asking for 3.2, but China only wants 3.0. What is 3.2? More access to the technology, to the market, and so on and so forth. So if we really want to do a simulation of a CFTA, the renegotiation itself, fairly the renegotiation need to be done at the product level, at the 6-digit or 8-digit product level. And that should be the fair treatment of ASEAN-China FTA itself, because that's where the real negotiation actually took place in terms of looking at the key products that we want to assess to China and what China want to assess to us. So fairly, as what Professor Shah mentioned, trade dependency is not about only linkages between geopolitics and geoeconomics. Creating a larger framework is equally important for ASEAN. So our ASEAN community has 3 pillars. ASEAN Political Security Community that works very closely to discuss the security and the governance issues and the rule-based governance issues. And then we have the ASEAN Economic Community, that is the trade dependency component coming in. The last one is the ASEAN Social Cultural Community itself. So the key part here is within these 3 pillars, ASEAN centrality is very important for us. So fairly, there's a non-intervention policy, a strong component for diplomacy itself. So diplomacy is not about trade dependency. Diplomacy is about creating a larger framework, a platform where we can bring up many issues and many issues that can be done at a diplomatic level rather than non-diplomatic level. And within ASEAN, we also have the East ASEAN Summit where China, Japan, Korea meets ASEAN with US, European Union, Australia, New Zealand come as observers, and they can participate in the East ASEAN Summit. So we need political platforms that escalate a lot of issues for us. And that is, again, not a framework that's been discussed in the paper. So I would like to see if we want to make reference to ASEAN and East Asia, and this kind of larger economic and political community that we build around becomes very important for us. A good example is APEC. APEC allows China, Russia, US to come together, and it's an economic cooperation. There's no serious rule base, but fairly give us many platforms to discuss many issues. This is my last slide. Incorporating the multilateral agreements and regional architecture such as APEC, RCEP, CPTPP is important in the analysis. It's not just bilateral. And second is diverging objectives of geopolitics, and the geoeconomics will be more interesting. Geoeconomics create more convergence and policy, whereas geopolitics create more divergence. A good example, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that allows for more fragmentation of policies rather than RCEP or CPTPP itself. Quickly, 3 points. In terms of result methodology and data, as I already mentioned, when I look at both the result for China, India, China, Pakistan, even China, Indonesia, Indonesia to give a lot of concession not to go for a war with China, whereas China has more incentive to extract more returns from Indonesia, which is not the case because there are a lot of multinationals in Indonesia, Chinese multinationals, that will change the configuration a lot. So where is the sub-game equilibrium? Where is it going to be a corner solution? That's where I'm going to lead. The way the divergence, the returns are diverging, I believe we're going to end up in the corner solutions. The sub-game will be at the corner solutions. So the data is from 1970 to 2017 because I do not know what are the parameters used for simulation, what kind of data. So it's a pre-COVID-19 and US-China trade war only started 2018. India-China analysis, there are many other factors such as BRICS, APEC, China-Indonesia, movement of people, movement of investment is very critical. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shandre. So for your insightful comments on the paper, so I appreciate your interesting views, and definitely your experiences are significant if we consider your work on trade and investment and productivity and economic growth, especially in the Southeast Asia and current leadership as a head of Jeffrey Chia Institute of Southeast Asia. So I definitely hope that the Mathias would have got the good thought-provoking questions to look at the analysis, and would like to comment on some of these questions raised by the Dr. Ajay and Professor Shandre. Professor Mathias, you will have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me first thank you, the two of you, for your very insightful comments, that I think point toward the desire to have a more realistic framework. And so before answering to, how much time do I have, Rachita, now?
It's showing me around 12 minutes, 12 to 13 minutes.
12 minutes, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. So, I mean, in my view, yeah, I would like, yeah, before going into the specifics of my answers, let me tell you that I agree with all what you say. Okay. You have to keep in mind that what I'm presenting now is really material that is still, that is subject to current research. It's there has been a lot of excitement because of the changing nature of globalization, in the past 5 or 10 years. There is now a lot of excitement in the academic community on those geoeconomic questions. And so a lot of research is now, on the move to understand those phenomena. And so many of the things you are asking for, or you would like to see in the model, actually, we are working on them. My colleagues, other researchers, my co-authors, and myself. So, I mean, I think that it's very inspiring what you say, because it confirms me into the belief that we should do more and work even more. So that's now related to also a general point is that, as Ajay you say, it's a model, it's a quantitative model. So I think it's the virtue of it is to have a benchmark, a quantitative benchmark, and then we need to have verbal discussions, and on how reality departs from this benchmark. And I think the main virtue of the quantitative estimates of the paper is that they offer a way of assessing what are the security dilemmas you observe in the data. So a security dilemma, what I call a security dilemma, is the fact that the way you manage trade dependence with your geopolitical rivals, is really subject to trade-offs. If you facilitate trade with your rivals, this is welfare improving, right? If you decrease trade barriers, you pursue a deeper trade integration, this is good for your real consumption. This is good for your growth in peace. What the analysis shows also is that it's also good for the risk of conflict itself. By deepening trade, you lower geopolitical risk. And I think that's the first virtue of this theoretical and quantitative framework, is to show that decoupling or coupling more feedbacks on the geopolitical risk itself. And I think it's a very simple point that I think policymakers are currently maybe underestimating in their analysis and in their decisions. They are underestimating how large can be this feedback effect of trade dependencies on conflict risk, And so a virtue of the framework here is to show, when I put number on that, even in a very simple model, I show that the effects are meaningful. Okay, so, and then we can depart. Then we can talk about, but in fact, in reality, it's more complex. But I think that's the first virtue of this approach. But then when you think of decoupling or coupling more, if you facilitate trade with your geopolitical rivals, it's also welfare detrimental, because of course, if you go at war with them, the true cost of war will be larger. Okay, and so I think that this is what the policymakers, for example, in the US have in mind, is that, if we go at war in the Pacific region, or if really we go in deep tensions, we are so dependent on Chinese imports that could be detrimental to US consumption, And so I think that's quite clear that this true cost of war is what policymakers have in mind. But what the analysis show is that, you should not forget that there is an additional effect that almost most of the time, if not all of the time, as you were pointing out, China, in the case of Asia, there is no war. War is out of equilibrium. Yet, there is a shadow cost, because in order to maintain out of equilibrium path war, you need to make concessions. Okay, so that's a policy objective that countries should keep in mind. And the quantitative analysis tells you that quantitatively, this effect of concessions is not second order. It's actually first order. That's an additional virtue, of coming with numbers in this kind of simple framework as a benchmark, that allows you to pinpoint what are the trade-offs. And then I think it's very important to engage into a discussion about realism, complexifying the model, etc. That's what I'm going to do now with you. So, I think there were questions both by Ajay and Shandre about you know, what is the equilibrium, corner solution, etc. In particular, Ajay, you asked the question, but so at equilibrium, I should never observe war, but always concessions made by India to China. Actually, in this type of model, you know, where you have negotiations under asymmetrical information, it has been shown, you know, historically in the mechanism design literature by, in particular, Meyerson-Satterthwaite, which is the first contribution to this literature with the seminal papers, that actually sometimes in some states of the world you observe bargaining failure because private information is very, you know, if it's too large. And so that's the same here in this diplomatic model. You may observe on equilibrium conflict and war. Okay, that's a theoretical point. There was, I think, a concern by the two of you about the fact that, you know, it's a bilateral model. Actually, maybe it was not clear, and I realized that it should be made clearer in the paper and also in the presentation. The trade model is a multi-country model. So you have trade creation and trade diversion effects from China to Japan in case of conflict, for example, with India. You know, so you have those third country effects. The trade model is a multi-country model. But the bargaining model, the diplomatic model, is a bilateral model. Okay, so I think many of the questions in particular you raised, Ajay, are, you know, addressed when I solve and simulate the trade equilibrium. This framework embeds substitution effect in case of a war, right? In case of a war, let's say between China and India, when you compute the trade equilibrium under war, there will be redirection of trade flows from India to the rest of the world and from China to the rest of the world. So those substitution effects are, you know, in the simulation, but yet what I don't have here is, because the trade model is simple, which is also one point that was raised by the two of you, there is no intermediate goods, there is no product level analysis. And so engaging into a conversation about, you know, what are the substitution effects, what about the sectors that have different elasticities of substitution, you know, is absent from the framework. Absent from the framework is, as you rightly pointed out, input-output linkages, you know, and global value chain effect, you know. So I'm currently working on that with Thierry Meyer and Isabelle Méjean. So, you know, we are really combining this type of diplomatic model with input-output linkage model, you know, as in Baquet, Fari, recent series of papers, where we can really discuss, I think, effects that go in your direction, you know. So we can discuss, for example, strategic goods. What are the goods that are very strategic to an economy? The ones that you cannot substitute easily away from China. Okay, so having a more realistic, more complex trade model with input-output linkages allow to discuss that. Vulnerability of sectors, you know, substitution between destinations, you know, and smart decoupling. If you want to decouple from another economy, from your rivals in a smart way, you first need to have a tool to identify what are the strategic sectors, you know, where substitution is low. Okay, so having a richer trade model allows you to do that. But that goes far beyond what I'm doing in this paper here. And we are still working on it. It's really, you know, the layer of complexity when you increase quite a lot.
Thank you, Mathias. So we would like to have we have couple of minutes left. We would like to have few questions from the panelists. If any would like to raise any question, please raise your hand. And the participants, please post your questions in the Q&A box. So there is one question, but I think it's slightly not related directly to the presentation, but the participant would like to ask when will Asia develop a common currency to aid economic trades? So if you would like to respond to it.
I think never.
Yeah. So if there is no further questions, so I will hand over to Daniel. And before that, I will thank to the speaker, Professor Mathias, and the discussants for this insightful session. Thank you. So over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Rachita, for the chairing the session, and to all the speakers. It's a very interesting session, and one that I think is quite unique compared to the other presentations in this conference. So I thank all of you again for taking the time to speak at this conference. So now we'll have a 30-minute break, not 30 minutes anymore, actually, 25-minute break. And we will reconvene at 4:45 p.m. Tokyo time for the final presentation. See you then. Thank you very much.